Labour has never done well in a UK election without doing really well in Scotland.
We need deposit ATMs and we need withdrawal ATMs, and we need a law that means that businesses have to accept cash.
UK workers have had the most bargaining power essentially since the 1970s because the jobs market is so tight.
Can Britain actually afford to maintain a global military presence?
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Coming up on today's programme, Modi's Moment. We speak to our man on the ground in New Delhi and ask whether this G20 summit marks a turning point for the influence of the global south.
And we're going to talk about something which affects almost everything we buy from abroad, but perhaps doesn't get all the attention it deserves. We're going to discuss shipping and UK trade policy.
But first, mental health is the fastest growing cause of long-term sickness in the UK. Long-term sickness is the number one factor behind the tight labour market, and that's driving inflation, which is, of course, the key priority for Rishi Sunak and the Bank of England, which makes it all the more interesting that private companies are boosting their mental health care provision. And Bloomberg's Olivia Fletcher and our senior economics reporter Phil Aldrick have reported on this. Olivia, what have you found?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that me and Phil have chatted about a lot. I guess we wanted to set out to see how this has been impacting employers, and the data that has been provided to us from the largest employee assistance program provider, you know, they provide kind of counselling and stuff like that to employers, is that demand for in-work mental health services is soaring. It implies that, you know, workers aren't looking to the publicly funded NHS anymore, which, you know, much like schools in Britain at the moment, is crumbling. Instead, workers are going to their bosses for counselling instead.
Olivia, do we have any sense of whether this is a genuine increase in mental illness, or is it something to do with awareness of mental illness? Do we have any data on that?
I think it's probably a bit of both. You know, there are a record number of people out of work sick right now due to mental health reasons. But we have just had the COVID pandemic that probably contributed to it a lot. I guess if we cast our minds back to, say, Dickensian Britain, you know, people working in warehouses probably were also not very mentally well, but we didn't have the whole concept of mental well-being that we have today.
Exactly. I do wonder whether it's just that people's expectations of mental well-being are higher when we're constantly flooded with all of, I am at least, adverts on Instagram about how you should be zen. Phil, cynically, is it that corporations are just trying to milk that awareness, or why is it that companies are doing this?
Well, they are getting encouragement to do this from the government and from sort of expert employment institutions like the Institute for Employment Studies. Occupational health is becoming a very important part of what companies, big companies, are offering and have to offer. The government has, they are expanding the support mechanisms they have to encourage businesses to have occupational health offerings for the staff. I mean, I guess it's kind of an appendage to HR nowadays, because there is this focus on mental well-being, and which, I mean, when I started out, in those days far gone by now, at work, there was no such thing as, you know, people wouldn't be thinking about mental health in work at all. So this has been quite a quick transformation, and even the Bank of England has, I think Hugh Pill at one point talked about sort of he was questioning whether this is due to attitudinal changes in the country. It seems to be a necessary offering from businesses now.
Phil, we know that reducing economic inactivity is a key focus for the government. How important is mental health in our tight labour market and the problems that's causing for our economy?
So we've got 2.5 billion people who are inactive due to sort of long-term sickness, and the about 2.4 million on benefits. You've got of that sort of 2.5 million cohort. There's something like close to a million, a little bit under a million people who have some kind of mental health related. Are they declaring some kind of mental health related problem? So it is a not insignificant issue, and to be fair, if you look back at the data, it has been a problem that was growing before the pandemic. It was you can definitely see the numbers creeping up. But what was happening then is that a lot of people were staying in work with these problems. And during the pandemic and since the pandemic, what has been noticeable is that people are falling out of work. So the increase has been more marked in the inactive population rather than in the employed population.
Well, that's particularly interesting, isn't it? Given the labour market is tight and there are plenty of jobs in many places, that's all the more surprising, isn't it?
Yeah. So you've got. That was why we kind of getting quite interested in this whole inactivity issue, because cost of living crisis. You thought people need to get as much income as possible, but what you were seeing is more and more people dropping out of the workforce, and just kind of how on earth do you square that circle? There is this issue, there's this sort of incentive problem potentially with the benefits system where, if you are declared, if you have got a long-term sickness, whether it's a physical or a mental health problem, you can you get these more flexible benefits where you don't have to just constantly look for a job, and also the benefit you can get is more generous, and you don't hit the benefit cap either. You're released from the benefit. So there's these kind of financial incentives to be on a health related benefit, and that increase has coincided with the cost of living crisis. So people who obviously would have been eligible for these benefits were not claiming these benefits before, and they've suddenly realised that they should. And I think the government is also a little bit concerned that there's a lot of people who are making slightly spurious claims because they can see the benefits of getting a more welfare income by moving on to these. So these benefits. So there's a sort of bizarre interplay here. No one can really unpick it, between how much of the mental health problem is entirely just down to mental health, how much is attitudinal changes, how much is basically, the benefit system actually encourages you to somehow qualify for these better, more generously funded benefits. So if you do feel like you're not mentally well, you might want to go and declare that to try and get if you're already out of work. So it's a very, very complex picture. Nobody has actually nailed it down, but there are all these moving parts to think about.
So that sounds a little bit like get on your bike, the modern version of get to your kitchen table and work from home. Olivia, you've been on before as our Gen Z correspondent, talking about how the younger generation doesn't want to partake in hustle culture. Did you see any generational divides in your reporting when it comes to mental health?
Certainly anecdotally, it does seem like this is something being led by Gen Z. We had that story about, them shunning hustle culture, but I've also written before about, UK bosses trying to offer them early finish Fridays as these kind of perks to keep young people in work, if it is the case that they are leading this trend of, shunning hustle culture and wanting to, focus more on their life than work. And, if you are working a lot, that might lead to mental health issues.
Burnout.
Yeah, exactly.
Phil, part of the government's plans include trying to encourage mentally ill workers to work from home where possible, but some parts of the government also criticise working from home as bad for the economy.
The Chancellor himself,
in fact. How does that all add up? How do they square that circle?
Well, I guess they're saying that there are, the flexible working arrangements that we have now would not have existed had the pandemic not happened. So there are obviously a lot of people who can just come back to work, but there are people who can't because they get so anxious in group situations or office environments or whatever. And so what I guess they're saying is that we've now demonstrated we can have flexible working. So for those who genuinely can't work from the office, you do have an opportunity still to work, but you can do it from home. So we'd like to encourage you to do that. I mean, to be sort of cynical about it, the government desperately needs to get as much money as possible, don't they? So if they reduce their benefits bill by encouraging people who would have been on benefits to work from home instead. This is an upside for them. So that they're definitely, and benefits bill is exploding. The government has a welfare cap. It's not an enforceable welfare cap, but it's basically a measure of how much is being spent on welfare. And they're $4 billion above that already. And the benefits bill is rising quite quickly in the forecasts in the years ahead. So you can see them desperately trying to use that metric to say we do need to get on top of welfare because we're in breach of our own sort of limits here. So they're trying to do something around this whole piece.
Great stuff. Right, thanks so much for both joining us in the studio today. That's Bloomberg's Olivia Fletcher and our senior economics reporter, Phil Aldrick.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak flies to New Delhi today for the G20 summit. The US President Joe Biden is going to attend this event in New Delhi, but he won't be meeting China's Premier Li. Leaders are expected to discuss issues from the economy to food security. And Bloomberg's international government enterprise editor Alan Crawford joins us now from New Delhi for more analysis. Great to have you on, Alan. What's at stake at this summit?
Well, quite apart from the various issues that you mentioned and more that are on the official agenda, there's also the bigger backdrop to this meeting is really an emerging divide between nations, the developed world, so to speak, in terms of it's represented by the G7 countries led by the US. And we're seeing a kind of emerging powers of the global south from Brazil, and obviously including the host India, really kind of asserting themselves. And so quite apart from these individual topics, we're seeing something of a struggle for influence around the world. And that's really the main thrust of the meetings over the next 2 days here in Delhi.
How significant is the absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin? Is that useful for Modi, or is it seen as a snub in India?
I don't think that Putin was ever going to show up. He didn't go to the last G20. He didn't even attend the more friendly BRICS summit for fear of being subject to an international arrest warrant. But Xi Jinping is a different matter. Obviously, it's the other superpower, and China has never made entirely clear why he's not coming along to the summit, but it does take place both against the backdrop of a real spiraling of tensions with the US, as well as significant tensions with India, the host here. So it's in some senses unsurprising you wouldn't go to a party held by your worst enemy, but at the same time, it is something of a blow to Modi's attempts to really kind of host a big global successful summit.
And also, of course, Alan, Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, is on his way to the summit. I'm actually looking at a picture in front of me where he's on his plane and our colleague Alex Wickham is right behind him. He appears to be tickling his shoulder. But I read that Rishi Sunak hopes to be welcomed as India's son-in-law because, of course, he has this special relationship with India. What can we expect there in Sunak's arrival?
Yes, he did make reference to that. To be fair to him, he said that he referred rather obliquely to having been referred to somewhere as India's son-in-law, which he said he hoped was meant affectionately. But yeah, I mean, of course, he's the first British Prime Minister of Indian origin. His wife is Indian, so it's undoubtedly significant in that sense, and perhaps arguably he should make a lot more of it as a big success story and a first. But that said, I don't really see it working to his favour in terms of being able to get any special concessions from Modi, for example.
How far is this meeting being seen as a turning point for the influence of the global south? It's something that's been going on for some time, but is this meeting really the one where the majority of the world exerts its influence?
That's certainly the way that the Indian Prime Minister would like to see it. I think not necessarily, not yet. Certainly, last month we saw a very significant moment where the BRICS grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they agreed to expand their bloc to include another 6 members. In other words, a lot of countries were joining up, were queuing up to join BRICS, and so that's an indication that. For all the protestations that it's not intended as a rival pole to the G7 or the West in general, there are a significant number of countries that have some sort of disaffection with the US-led world order. And I think we're only going to see more of that, both at this summit, but then bear in mind that the next host of the G20 that takes over the baton from Modi is Brazil. So, the first letter in the alphabet of BRICS. So I think that it's part of a trend and a process.
Well, it might not be the first letter if they've got these additions, Alan. They'll be an alphabet soup. All right, thanks to Bloomberg's International Government Enterprise Editor, Alan Crawford, joining us from New Delhi. Thank you.
Now, with the low-hanging fruit of post-Brexit trade deals picked, trade is a topic that we hear less and less about. But next week is London International Shipping Week, and one theme that's bound to come up, one that is recurrent in British politics, is inadequate public investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about a lot this week in the context of schools. But look, Maritime carries 95% of UK trade, and yet it continues to get less public investment than aviation and rail, despite the pandemic serving as a reminder of Britain's vulnerability as an island nation. To discuss, joining us now is Nick Brown, CEO of Lloyd's Register, which is one of the capital's oldest institutions and a heavyweight in the shipping industry. And we also have Chris Shirling-Rooke, CEO of Maritime UK, which is the umbrella body for the £46 billion maritime sector. Welcome to you both. Brexit has been the major change in UK trade. The government's set to delay imposing full post-Brexit import controls on goods from the EU again until January 2024. Would you say that the government's doing enough to, quote-unquote, get Brexit done, to ease trade frictions?
I think, God, that's such a great question and quite complicated. However, the thing I always remember with maritime is we are millennia old. And whilst we're having Brexit, we've also kept the UK fed, fueled and supplied through far more larger crises. So I think we need to be mindful that whilst we're facing some headwinds currently, maritime is such a strong and integral industry. We've been dealing with challenges for millennia.
Nick, how different is the UK shipping landscape now to pre-pandemic? Obviously, we had a huge surge in shipping rates, didn't we, during the pandemic? And I think they've come down a bit now. But how has the industry changed?
Well, I think ultimately maritime and shipping as an industry just needs to be much higher up the political and indeed public society consciousness. As you mentioned, during the pandemic, we saw a massive strain on global supply chains. And in the world we live in today of geopolitical insecurity, a climate emergency, a cost of living crisis, you've already mentioned 95% of trade reaches the UK and indeed most of the world via shipping. So securing energy, food and supply chains has never been more important. And when you couple that with our need to urgently decarbonise, the need to dramatically increase investment in the industry and public support is critical and urgent.
But Nick, is what you hear from Labour actually materially different from what you hear from the government when it comes to trade?
I don't think there's a huge amount of material difference. Ultimately, it will depend on what's delivered, but ultimately the rhetoric seems very similar.
You said there wasn't a lot of difference between the Tories and Labour when it comes to trade and shipping policy. Yes, we need to see the delivery, but in the rhetoric, much of a muchness. What do you actually want to see as we head towards the general election? This is your chance, of course, to shape policy.
I mean, ultimately, I think we've seen a massive amount of investment in the industry, in the companies, ship owners, shipbuilders, equipment manufacturers, to actually make zero carbon shipping now possible. And that all of that action has happened over the last 5 years. So we are now seeing both river vessels, cross-channel ferries, and indeed deep sea shipping that are able to carry goods from Asia to Europe and the UK, all being designed and have technology available such that they can run on new zero carbon fuels like hydrogen or ammonia. What we are very concerned about is there is a significant risk at the moment that when these ships reach port, there won't be any zero carbon fuels for them to load. And we see that as being a massive chicken and egg situation where why would anyone invest in a vessel that can operate on zero emission fuels, zero carbon fuels, if those fuels have not been produced and not been stimulated by government? And of course, this is not just a single government or a single nation challenge. This is something which is an international collaboration requirement. And that's why you might remember at COP26 with the Clydebank Declaration, there was a real focus on trying to find the low-hanging fruit, the so-called green corridors, where we can find the opportunities for the biggest ports in the world to actually make real investments and commitments to having those clean fuels, whether it's shore charging facilities for ferries going across the English Channel, or it's the availability of green fuels in ports, such that those investments can take place. But clearly, it takes a significant amount of government incentivization and prioritization over other, perhaps more domestic challenges to make sure the green fuels are available when the ships start arriving.
So 90% of stuff that's moved, that's traded, goes on a boat globally. I think there's a real opportunity, though, here. Undoubtedly, the UK is a world leader in decarb technology, and we're also a world leader in maritime. So when you have these two really interesting parts of the economy coming together, it can have a real effect on jobs and growth. We see technology now, which could be implemented, whether it be, well, certainly in pure shipping, but also within ports, within the great supply chain, where the regulation isn't quite keeping up with it. And if we could move that a little bit quicker, we could have that quicker impact.
It isn't just carbon emissions, though, is it? Shipping does use a lot of dirty fuel, and I'm thinking of particulate emissions. It is quite a polluting industry, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why we'll be encouraging the government to build on all of the great work that they've done since Maritime 2050. And really look closely at actually what's the next bit of investment that's needed, according to some of the work we've done at Maritime UK, and based on the back of the International Chamber of Shipping, who they think it's about 3 trillion will be needed to decarbonise. We think probably a couple of billion a year from government. Industry will match that moving forward. And again, when I'm talking about government, I'm not particularly focused on the colour. We're saying actually this is probably what's needed, and from that, you're right. It's everything from it's the innovation in the R&D. It's the sort of how do we green up ships more? How do we put the green infrastructure into ports? So they've got the power supplies, so ships might not need any dirty fuel. They can just plug the batteries in.
Nick, what's the state of the UK's shipping infrastructure? Are we investing enough in our ports?
No, we are not. I think that's where we need a much greater emphasis for government investment, government money. We believe that it's going to take around £75 billion just to decarbonise the UK domestic maritime sector. Approximately half of that is going to be required for the vessels, and the other half for the ports and shoreside infrastructure to make sure those fuels and charging facilities are available for ships. So short answer is no.
That's a huge amount of money. How much of this needs to come from the taxpayer, and how much of it can be taken care of by the private sector?
I think it's going to be a balance. It's clearly that we have now started to see the emergence of emission trading schemes. So for the first time, we're going to see a price on carbon emissions in shipping over the coming years. So there's an opportunity for those that emit to contribute towards that investment. But there is the short answer is decarbonisation is not going to be cheap. It's going to take globally trillions of dollars to decarbonise the whole industry. But there's a lot we can do domestically here. River vessels, domestic trade, vessels that are going out to our North Sea wind farms. The technology is already there. Those vessels can operate on hydrogen. Those vessels can operate on electric. We've got home-bred technology innovators that have innovated, organizations like Artemis Technologies that have invested in electric high-speed ferries to be able to move the engineers that are servicing those wind farms. But it's really the port infrastructure that we've got to make sure is ready at the same time, and that investment is already running late.
And just briefly, do you think this is on the government's radar?
Not high enough, unfortunately. And I think actually in a world where we've just experienced the pandemic and seen the impact that has on trade and the economy, when supply chains are stretched and disrupted and you have ports full of ships because there's not enough people working in the ports to actually unload the ships and get the cargo on and off, that's really what led to the spike in container shipping rates during the last 2-3 years of the pandemic. Now we've seen energy security with the Russia-Ukraine conflict being high up on the agenda, but as an island state, as you say, so much of our food, our energy, the need for us to keep our houses warm during winter comes to us via sea. So it does. I think actually shipping needs to be much, much higher up on the political agenda.
Nick Brown, CEO of Lloyd's Register, and we also have Chris Shirling-Rooke, CEO of Maritime UK. Thank you both for joining us. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock and our audio engineer was Maruful Hussain. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.